Greetings to you wherever you are. Today, I want to talk about you and your enemies. Every person has enemies. Having enemies is part of life. You may know some of your enemies and you may not know some of your enemies. Now, what are your enemies? Your enemies are people who don't love you. Your enemies are people who hate you because of one reason or the other. Your enemies are people who hate you without any reason. Your enemies are people who mock you. Your enemies are people who curse you. Your enemies are people who persecute you. Your enemies are people who want you to die. Your enemies are people who don't wish you good in life. Your enemies are people who make life unbearable for you in one form or the other. However, how does God want you to treat your enemies? He wants you to love them. God wants you to love your enemies by praying for them the way you pray for yourself. God wants you to love your enemies by blessing them. God wants you to love your enemies by greeting them. God wants you to love your enemies by forgiving them. God wants you to love your enemies by giving them money. God wants you to love your enemies by giving them food. God wants you to love your enemies by giving them clothes. God wants you to love your enemies by giving them shelter. God wants you to love your enemies by doing good to them. God wants you to love your enemies by not wishing them dead. Moreover, the ability to love your enemies is a sign that God is in your heart. This is because that is what God does. God also has enemies. His enemies are people who don't follow His word for their age, but He still loves them. For instance, He makes His Son available to His enemies. He also sends rain to His enemies. Do you love your enemies? If your answer is no, pray to God that He will help you do so. Thank you very much for watching this video. Till we meet again, the Lord bless you. The Lord bless me.